The city streets lay bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, casting long shadows over the quiet suburban neighborhood. It was late, almost midnight, and most of the homes were dark, with only a few porch lights illuminating driveways. The world seemed to be holding its breath in the stillness, but for Malcolm Johnson, this was a familiar hour. After a long day of investigating cases as an off-duty detective, the quiet moments of his drive home were his personal time to decompress. Malcolm, 35, was a tall, imposing figure, but with a calm and easygoing demeanor that belied his size. His well-worn suit jacket was slung over the passenger seat, his tie loosened, and the tired lines around his eyes hinted at the exhaustion of a long day. His mind wandered to his family, Tanya, his wife, and their 2 young children, Zion, 7, and Maya, 4. He smiled softly, thinking of Zion's excited retelling of a school soccer game and Maya's endless chatter about her new favorite cartoon. They were probably asleep now, Tanya having wrangled them into bed a few hours earlier. The thought of them sleeping peacefully in their warm home was enough to drive Malcolm to push through his fatigue for just a few more miles. As he turned onto Cedar Drive, only 3 blocks from home, a flash of light caught his attention in the rearview mirror. A police cruiser. It wasn't uncommon in this part of town, but Malcolm's stomach tightened slightly. He dismissed the feeling as nothing, just a routine patrol. Still, he couldn't help the instinctive caution that years of being a black man, even in a position of authority, had ingrained in him. The cruiser followed him, its headlights growing closer. Malcolm's grip on the steering wheel tightened, and his pulse quickened just a little. He'd been in this situation before, but it never got easier. He turned down the volume on the soft jazz playing through the radio, focusing on the road ahead. The cruiser's lights suddenly flashed red and blue, cutting through the night. The siren wailed briefly. Malcolm sighed deeply, pulling over to the side of the road. His mind raced as he ran through his options. He was off duty, not wearing his badge in a visible spot, just a tired man driving home after a long day. But none of that seemed to matter now. The cruiser parked behind him, its headlights casting long shadows that flickered over Malcolm's dashboard. His fingers flexed on the wheel, muscles tensing, as he watched in the side mirror. 2 officers stepped out of the vehicle. One of them, Officer Brady, a young white officer in his late 20s, looked eager, almost too confident. His partner, Officer Jenkins, followed a step behind, more cautious but silent. Malcolm rolled down his window slowly, hoping for a straightforward encounter. He knew the protocol: keep calm, stay compliant, and avoid any sudden movements. His heart thudded steadily in his chest, but his expression remained composed. Brady approached the window, his face a mask of rigid authority. License and registration, he demanded brusquely, not even a hint of pleasantry in his tone. Malcolm nodded, keeping his movements deliberate as he reached for his wallet. "Evening, officer. I'm Detective Malcolm Johnson, with the..." "Just show me your license and registration," Brady cut him off, his hand hovering near his holster. His tone was sharp, filled with impatience and suspicion. Malcolm's jaw tightened, but he handed over his ID and registration without a word. He knew better than to argue, at least not yet. The situation could escalate far too quickly if he wasn't careful. Brady eyed the documents, his lips curling into a barely concealed sneer. He looked Malcolm up and down, as if searching for something that wasn't there. "What you doing in this neighborhood?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. Malcolm met his gaze steadily. "I live here, just a few blocks away." Brady's eyes narrowed, clearly unimpressed. He handed the documents to Jenkins, who looked at them briefly before handing them back to Brady. Jenkins had been silent this whole time, seemingly letting his partner take the lead. For a brief moment, Malcolm thought it might end here. Maybe they'd realize their mistake, return his papers, and let him go. But Brady's stance remained aggressive, his suspicions unchecked. "We've had reports of some break-ins around here recently," Brady said, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "You match the description." Malcolm's pulse quickened. He had heard these lines before. Reports of break-ins matching the description. They were vague, coded phrases often used to justify unnecessary stops. Still, he kept his voice calm. "Officer, I'm just heading home from work. I can assure you I haven't..." Brady stepped back, eyes locked on Malcolm. "Step out of the vehicle." Malcolm's heart pounded harder now. He knew this wasn't right, but he also knew arguing would get him nowhere. Reluctantly, he opened the door and stepped out, his hands visible at his sides. The cool night air hit him, but it did nothing to cool the rising tension in his chest. Brady's hand rested on his holster, eyes sharp with a suspicion Malcolm had seen too many times before. This wasn't about procedure anymore, this was about control, and Brady had all the wrong instincts. Malcolm stood there, tall and composed, but inside he was fighting a growing storm. The air was thick with tension as Malcolm stood beside his car, his eyes meeting Officer Brady's with a calmness that only years of experience could bring. The weight of this encounter pressed down on him, but he remained steady. He had dealt with situations far more dangerous than this, yet the familiar knot of anxiety twisted in his stomach. Jenkins, the quieter of the two officers, stood to the side, hands resting loosely near his belt, eyes flicking nervously between Brady and Malcolm. "Turn around, hands on the car," Brady ordered, his tone sharp and authoritarian. Malcolm paused for a moment, trying to gauge the situation. He knew that complying was his best chance to avoid this escalating further, but his patience was wearing thin. "Officer, I've already explained." Now Brady snapped, his voice cutting through the quiet night. Malcolm exhaled slowly and turned, placing his hands on the roof of his car. He could feel Brady's eyes boring into him, the young officer's arrogance palpable. Malcolm's mind raced, trying to keep his emotions in check. He knew he had done nothing wrong, but that didn't always matter in situations like this. He could hear Tanya's voice in his head, reminding him to stay calm, to come home safe. Behind him, Jenkins shifted uneasily. The older officer wasn't saying much, but Malcolm could sense his discomfort. Perhaps Jenkins wasn't entirely on board with Brady's approach, but he wasn't stepping in either. That, Malcolm knew, could be just as dangerous. Brady patted him down roughly, hands lingering longer than necessary. "What are you doing out here so late?" He muttered. "Doesn't seem like the kind of neighborhood you'd be living in." Malcolm clenched his jaw, feeling the insult like a punch to the gut. He had heard comments like that before, thinly veiled behind "just doing my job" rhetoric. His badge was tucked in the inner pocket of his jacket, but he wanted to see how far this would go before revealing it. Brady clearly had something to prove, and Malcolm didn't want to give him the satisfaction just yet. "I told you I live just down the street," Malcolm replied, keeping his voice calm, though it was getting harder by the second. "I'm a detective with the city police." Brady snorted dismissively. "Detective, huh? We'll see about that." He pulled out his radio, calling in Malcolm's license plate. The seconds dragged into minutes as they stood in the silence, the only sound being the faint hum of distant traffic and the static from Brady's radio. Malcolm felt his heart rate pick up. He knew there was nothing on his record, nothing that could incriminate him, but the humiliation of being treated this way after years of service cut deep. He thought about his kids, Zion and Maya. What would they think if they saw their father like this? What would this teach them about the world they were growing up in? Brady's radio crackled to life, but the response was garbled. Brady frowned, clearly frustrated. Jenkins, still standing off to the side, looked like he wanted to speak up, but something held him back. Whether it was fear of Brady's reaction or the unspoken code of backing up your partner, Malcolm couldn't tell. Brady turned back to Malcolm, his hand twitching near his belt. "You mind explaining why we haven't been able to verify anything yet, detective? You got something to hide." Malcolm took a deep breath, fighting the urge to snap. He knew it wouldn't end well if he did. His eyes flicked to Jenkins again, hoping for some sign of reason, but Jenkins just looked away, his lips pressed into a thin line. "You can check my badge," Malcolm said, keeping his voice steady. "It's in my jacket. I'm not armed." Brady narrowed his eyes, clearly not willing to back down. He approached Malcolm, his hand hovering closer to his holster. "Sure, I'll check," he said, stepping closer. "But if you make any sudden moves, we're going to have a problem." Malcolm swallowed the bitter taste of frustration and nodded. "Go ahead." Brady reached into Malcolm's jacket, his fingers brushing against the badge. For a moment, Malcolm thought this might finally be over. But then Brady's face twisted into a sneer as he held the badge up to the light, scrutinizing it like it was some counterfeit item. "This could be fake," Brady said, shaking his head. "You don't exactly look like a detective." That comment hit harder than Malcolm expected. He'd faced racial prejudice before, even within his own department, but it never stopped stinging. His temper flared briefly, but he kept it in check, breathing deeply. "That's real," Malcolm replied, his voice firm but measured. "I've been with the department for 12 years. I'm heading home after a long day, just like I said." Jenkins finally spoke up, his voice quiet but firm. "Brady, maybe we should just call this in again. Check his badge number directly." Brady shot him a glare, clearly not wanting to lose face in front of his partner. But Jenkins's words seemed to break through the haze of arrogance surrounding Brady. Reluctantly, Brady clicked on his radio again and gave Malcolm's badge number to dispatch. Malcolm stood there, his hands still on the roof of the car, his muscles tense as he waited. He could feel the cold air against his skin, but the anger burning inside kept him warm. He glanced over at Jenkins, who avoided his gaze, clearly conflicted but unwilling to cross the line that would put him at odds with his partner. Seconds passed like hours, but finally the crackle of the radio brought the moment of truth. Badge number matches. That's Detective Malcolm Johnson with the city police. Brady stiffened. Malcolm saw the shift in his posture, the immediate regret that flashed across his face, though the young officer quickly masked it with a scowl. Jenkins looked down, a shadow of embarrassment crossing his features. Brady uncuffed Malcolm, his movements stiff and awkward. "Looks like there was a mix-up," he muttered, though the apology in his voice was barely there. "You're free to go." Malcolm rubbed his wrists, feeling the sting of the cold metal that had gripped them just moments before. He locked eyes with Brady, the officer's bravado deflating now that the truth was out. Malcolm's voice was calm, but the steel in it was unmistakable. "Next time, maybe don't jump to conclusions." Brady didn't respond, his pride wounded and his authority in tatters. Jenkins stepped forward, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Sorry about that, Detective Johnson. We were just following protocol." Malcolm didn't bother to respond to Jenkins' weak apology. He wasn't interested in excuses. He simply grabbed his documents from Brady's outstretched hand, gave them both one last look, and without another word, got back into his car. The sound of Malcolm's engine hummed softly as he pulled away from the curb, leaving the officer standing in the red glow of his taillights. His fingers flexed on the steering wheel, tension still coiling through his muscles. He drove down the quiet street, past the familiar houses with manicured lawns and well-kept gardens, but everything felt different now. What should have been a routine night home was derailed, all because two officers couldn't see past the color of his skin. As he turned the corner toward his neighborhood, Malcolm's phone buzzed on the passenger seat. He glanced at the screen. Tanya. His heart tightened with a mix of love and concern. She had likely woken up, noticing he was late. He hesitated for a moment, still not fully composed from the encounter with the officers, but picked up the phone with a steady hand. "Hey, babe," he answered, trying to keep his voice even. "Malcolm, are you okay? You're later than usual." Tanya's voice was soft but filled with worry. She knew Malcolm's routine to the minute, and any deviation was enough to make her anxious, especially in today's world. "I'm fine," he said, though the words felt like a lie. "Just a long day at the office." There was a brief pause on the line. He could hear Tanya's hesitation. She knew him too well to accept such a simple answer. "You sure? You sound off." Malcolm exhaled slowly, letting the tension drain just enough to speak more honestly. "Yeah, just ran into some trouble with the police. Nothing serious, but you know how it is." Tanya's sharp intake of breath cut through the line. She didn't need him to explain any further. The reality of being a black man in America, even one with a badge, was not lost on her. "What happened?" she asked quietly, her voice tinged with anger and fear. "Nothing major. I got pulled over." "They didn't believe I was a detective at first," Malcolm said, trying to play it down. "It's fine now. I'm almost home." "It's not fine, Malcolm," Tanya replied, her voice firmer now. "You're out there protecting the city, and they treat you like a criminal. When is it going to stop?" Malcolm's silence was his only answer. He didn't have an easy response because she was right. Despite all the progress he'd made, all the years he'd served with dignity and integrity, moments like this reminded him that no matter his position, no matter his title, to some, he was still just another black man on the street. "I'll be home in 5, he said finally, his voice softer now. "We can talk more then, all right?" Tanya sighed. "Okay, be careful, Malcolm. I love you." "I love you too," he said. The words grounding him, as he hung up and slipped the phone back onto the seat. As the lights of his home came into view, the knot in his stomach loosened slightly. The porch light was on, casting a warm glow on the front door. It was late, but Tanya always left the light on for him, like a beacon calling him back from the chaos of the world. He parked in the driveway and sat there for a moment, staring at the house, his sanctuary, the place where he could finally let his guard down. But even as he walked up the driveway, the encounter from earlier replayed in his mind. His badge, his experience, his years of service had meant nothing to Officer Brady. To Brady, he was suspicious simply because of where he was and how he looked. Malcolm entered the house quietly, the familiar creak of the front door signaling his arrival. Tanya was waiting in the kitchen, her arms crossed, worry etched into her features. She wore a light robe, her dark hair pulled back into a messy bun. Her eyes softened when she saw him, but the tension in her posture didn't ease. "Hey," she said, her voice low, as she closed the distance between them. Malcolm wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her shoulder for a moment, feeling the warmth of her embrace. Tanya's hands stroked his back, soothing and steady. "You don't have to pretend it's okay, Malcolm," she murmured. "I know it isn't." He pulled back slightly, looking into her eyes. "I know, but I'm fine. I'm tired of it, tired of having to prove myself every time." Tanya nodded, her face hardening with empathy. "I don't know how you do it every day." Malcolm gave a small, rueful smile. "I do it because I don't have a choice, because of Zion and Maya and all the people who need me out there. But sometimes it's harder than others." Tanya squeezed his hand. "I worry about you, Malcolm. What if next time they don't let you explain? What if?" Her words trailed off, the unspoken fear hanging heavy between them. Malcolm pulled her close again, kissing the top of her head. "I'll be careful, I promise." They stood in silence for a moment, both lost in their own thoughts. The reality of the world outside was always a part of their lives, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to rear its ugly head. But for now, at least they were home, together, safe. A soft creak echoed from upstairs, and both Malcolm and Tanya turned their heads toward the sound. Little footsteps padded down the hall, and soon, Zion appeared at the top of the stairs, rubbing his eyes sleepily. "Daddy," Zion's small voice called out, blinking against the hallway light. Malcolm smiled, the heaviness lifting from his chest just a little. "Hey, champ," he said, motioning for him to come down. Zion shuffled down the stairs in his pajamas, his eyes still heavy with sleep. He made his way to Malcolm and hugged his leg tightly, looking up with a sleepy but happy smile. "You're home late," he mumbled. Malcolm knelt down to Zion's level, ruffling his son's curly hair. "Yeah, but I'm home now. You should be in bed though, kiddo." Zion nodded but didn't move. Instead, he leaned into his father's chest, closing his eyes again. Malcolm picked him up gently, carrying him back toward the stairs. Tanya followed them, her arms crossed, but her smile was softer now, watching the quiet moment between father and son. "He stayed up late, waiting for you," she whispered, a hint of amusement in her voice. Malcolm smiled back, feeling a surge of love for his family that pushed back the anger of the night. He carried Zion up to his room and tucked him back into bed, smoothing the blankets over him as the boy drifted off again. As he watched Zion sleep, the weight of the day seemed to settle heavily on Malcolm's shoulders once more. He was home, safe, with the people he loved. But out there, in the world beyond these walls, things weren't that simple. He kissed Zion's forehead and left the room quietly, pulling the door shut behind him. Tanya was waiting at the top of the stairs, her expression more serious now. "We need to talk about this, Malcolm," she said softly. He nodded, knowing she was right. The conversation wasn't over, far from it. Malcolm and Tanya sat at the kitchen table, the dim light from the overhead lamp casting long shadows across the room. The house was quiet now. Zion and Maya were both asleep, but the tension between them filled the space. Tanya sat across from him, her hands folded together tightly, her face set in a look of quiet frustration. "I hate this," she said, breaking the silence. "I hate that you have to go through this. That we have to go through this." Malcolm ran his hand through his hair, sighing deeply. "I know. Trust me, I hate it too." Tanya's eyes narrowed, the concern she had felt earlier giving way to the anger that had been simmering beneath the surface. But it's not just tonight, Malcolm. It's every time you walk out that door. Every time you put that badge on and step into the world. I'm terrified something worse will happen. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the table. He didn't have the words to ease her fears, because those same fears lived inside him too. The uniform didn't protect him from prejudice sometimes, it made him more of a target. I'm careful, Malcolm said, his voice quieter now, as if that would somehow make the reality easier to bear. I'm always careful. Tanya shook her head, her frustration spilling over. Being careful isn't enough, Malcolm. You're a detective, you've been with the department for over a decade. And that still wasn't enough tonight. What does that say? Her words hit hard because they were the truth. Malcolm didn't respond immediately, letting the weight of her words settle over him. He had spent years proving himself, rising through the ranks, hoping that his work, his dedication, and his service would shield him from the worst of it. But here he was stopped, questioned, handcuffed just for existing in a neighborhood that someone like Brady thought he didn't belong in. I know it's not fair, he said finally, his voice thick with the emotions he usually kept bottled up. But what else am I supposed to do? I can't walk away from my job. I can't stop being who I am. Tanya's expression softened as she reached out and took his hand. I don't want you to stop being you. I need to know that you're going to come home every night. Safe. Malcolm nodded, squeezing her hand gently. I'll come home. I promise. But even as he said the words, a part of him knew they were hollow. He could promise to be careful, promise to do everything by the book, but in the end, the world didn't always care about those promises. The kitchen fell into silence again, heavy with the unspoken realities they both had to live with. Tanya rose from her seat, pouring herself a glass of water, her back turned to Malcolm for a moment as she composed herself. When she turned back around, her voice was quieter, more measured. Do you think you'll report it? She asked, leaning against the counter. Malcolm sighed again, running his hands over his face. The thought had crossed his mind. He could file a formal complaint against Brady, go through the internal process, maybe get a slap on the wrist for the young officer. But part of him knew it wouldn't change much. Brady wasn't the first officer to treat him like this, and he wouldn't be the last. It was systemic, a problem bigger than one encounter or one complaint. I don't know if it's worth it, Malcolm admitted. What good will it do? I'll just be the guy making waves, and Brady will keep doing what he's doing, to someone else. Tanya frowned, but she didn't argue. She understood how the system worked, maybe better than most. Being married to a police detective meant seeing the inner workings of law enforcement from both sides. She knew the uphill battle Malcolm would face if he tried to push back. And she knew how exhausting that battle could be. Maybe, she said softly, but if you don't say anything, it's like letting him win. Letting them keep doing this to people like you. Malcolm looked down at the table, tracing a pattern in the wood grain with his finger. He knew she was right, but it didn't make the decision any easier. I'll think about it, he said quietly. Before Tanya could respond, there was a sudden knock at the door. Both of them froze, their eyes meeting across the room. It was too late for anyone to be stopping by. Malcolm's instincts kicked in immediately. He rose from the table, gesturing for Tanya to stay back as he moved toward the door. His hand brushed over the badge in his pocket, a habit that had been ingrained in him over the years. When he opened the door, he was greeted by the last person he expected to see. Sergeant Davis, his supervisor, stood on the front porch, his face a mask of concern. Davis was in his late 40s, with graying hair at his temples and a no-nonsense demeanor that commanded respect. But tonight there was something different in his eyes, something deeper than just professional concern. Malcolm, Davis said, his voice low. I heard about what happened tonight. Malcolm felt his stomach drop. News had traveled fast. Of course it had. Word always got around quickly in their precinct. Davis stepped inside, his eyes scanning the quiet house before settling on Malcolm's face. I just came by to check on you. Make sure you're all right? Malcolm nodded, though he wasn't sure how to respond. I'm fine, Sarge. It wasn't anything I couldn't handle. Davis's brow furrowed, his expression darkening. I read the report Brady submitted. Didn't sit right with me. I've already spoken to Jenkins, and he gave me the full picture. Malcolm's chest tightened. He hadn't expected this. And Brady was out of line, Davis said firmly. I've already started the process to formally reprimand him. You don't need to file anything if you don't want to. I've got this. Malcolm blinked, caught off guard by the support. He had expected to be left to deal with this on his own, but Davis was standing in his living room, offering to take up the fight for him. You don't have to do that, Malcolm said, though part of him felt relief at the offer. Davis shook his head. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do. You've been with this department long enough and you deserve better. Hell, everyone does. Malcolm let out a long breath, feeling the weight of the night finally start to lift. Thank you, he said quietly. Davis nodded, his expression softening slightly. I'll keep you updated. Just take care of yourself, all right? With that, Davis gave a short nod to Tanya, who had been standing quietly in the background, before turning to leave. Malcolm watched as his sergeant disappeared into the night, his figure fading into the shadows. Tanya stepped up beside Malcolm, slipping her hand into his. Looks like you have an ally, she said, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and caution. Yeah, Malcolm said, though part of him still felt wary. I guess so. They stood there for a moment, both silently processing what had just happened. For the first time that night, Malcolm felt like maybe, just maybe, things might change, but he knew better than to get his hopes up too high. The road ahead was long, and tonight was just one battle in a much bigger fight. The next morning, the sun peeked over the horizon, casting a soft golden light through the blinds of Malcolm's bedroom. He lay awake, his arm draped over Tanya, who slept peacefully beside him. The weight of last night's events still lingered in his mind, but in the quiet moments before the day fully began, he tried to focus on the warmth and safety of home. Malcolm turned his head slightly, watching Tanya's steady breathing, her face relaxed in sleep. She had been right, of course, about everything. Last night wasn't just another routine stop. It was a reminder of the daily fight they both lived through. The world was changing slowly, but encounters like the one he'd had with Brady showed just how deep some wounds still ran. He carefully slipped out of bed, not wanting to wake Tanya. There was a lot to think about today, and he needed a moment to gather his thoughts before diving into it all again. After getting dressed, Malcolm walked quietly downstairs, the wooden steps creaking beneath his feet. In the kitchen, the morning light streamed through the windows, casting soft patterns across the table where he and Tanya had sat last night. He poured himself a cup of coffee, the familiar smell grounding him as he took a seat at the table, his thoughts already swirling. The doorbell rang, pulling Malcolm out of his reverie. It was too early for visitors, and his mind immediately raced through the possibilities. Could it be Davis again, or someone from the precinct? Was it something to do with Brady? Malcolm stood, his muscles tensing slightly as he moved to the front door. He opened it to find Officer Jenkins standing on his porch, looking far more nervous than he had the night before. The older officer shifted his weight from foot to foot, his expression one of genuine discomfort. Malcolm had known Jenkins for years, though they hadn't worked closely. He wasn't a bad cop, just one who often took the path of least resistance, a trait that had gotten him in trouble last night. Detective Johnson Jenkins greeted, his voice low. I hope I'm not disturbing you. Malcolm stepped aside, nodding toward the living room. Come in. I assume this isn't a social call. Jenkins gave a shaky laugh, stepping inside and rubbing the back of his neck as he entered the living room. Malcolm gestured for him to sit, but Jenkins remained standing, fidgeting as though he didn't quite know how to begin. I wanted to apologize, Jenkins said finally, his words tumbling out quickly. Last night with Brady, I should have spoken up. I should have done something. Malcolm crossed his arms, studying Jenkins carefully. The man's discomfort was palpable, and Malcolm could see the guilt weighing heavily on him. It was a familiar look, the one of someone who had stood by when they should have acted but didn't have the courage to intervene. Jenkins cleared his throat, his gaze falling to the floor. Look, I didn't agree with how Brady handled things. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't stop him, and I'm sorry for that. Malcolm leaned back against the wall, letting Jenkins's words hang in the air for a moment. He appreciated the apology, but words didn't undo what had happened. Still, Malcolm had seen enough in his career to know when someone was being genuine. Why didn't you say anything? Malcolm asked, his tone not accusatory but curious. Jenkins hesitated, rubbing his hands together nervously. Brady, he's young, he's got a chip on his shoulder. I didn't want to undermine him in the field, you know. We're supposed to have each other's backs. Malcolm nodded slowly. He understood the pressure of backing up your partner. But there was a line that Brady had crossed and Jenkins had allowed him to cross. Having each other's backs doesn't mean staying silent when your partner's in the wrong, Malcolm said quietly. You know that. Jenkins nodded quickly, his face flushing with shame. I do, and I should have stopped him. I've been thinking about it all night. What if it had been someone else? Someone who didn't have a badge to fall back on? It could have gone a lot worse. Malcolm's eyes flicked to the window, where the sun was now fully up, casting light on the street outside. His mind flashed back to the moment when Brady had pulled his gun, how easily things could have spiraled into something far more dangerous. He looked back at Jenkins, whose face was pale with the weight of that realization. It's not just about me, Malcolm said, his voice steady. What happened last night? It happens to people who don't have the power to push back. That's what makes it so dangerous. Jenkins looked down, nodding slowly. I know, you're right. There was a long silence between them, the gravity of the conversation sinking in. Malcolm didn't want to dismiss Jenkins's apology, but he also knew it wasn't just a personal issue, it was part of something much larger, something that wouldn't change overnight with one apology. I'm not asking for an apology, Malcolm said finally, his tone soft but firm. What I want is for you to do better. Next time you see something like that, whether it's with Brady or anyone else, you speak up, because if you don't, it's going to keep happening. Jenkins looked up at Malcolm, his eyes filled with guilt and something else, determination. You're right, he said again. I will. I won't let this happen again. Not on my watch. Malcolm studied him for a moment longer before finally giving a nod. He believed Jenkins meant it, but he knew that words were just the beginning. Actions were what mattered, and only time would tell if Jenkins would follow through on his promise. I appreciate you coming by, Malcolm said, extending his hand. Jenkins took it, shaking firmly. Thank you, Detective. I'll do better. With that, Jenkins turned and left, walking out into the morning sun. Malcolm stood at the door for a moment, watching him go, the weight of the previous night still lingering but starting to lift, just a little. He wasn't sure if anything would truly change, but at least one person had acknowledged the wrongs of the night before. As he closed the door and returned to the kitchen, Malcolm felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, frustration, hope, and doubt all swirling together. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he couldn't fight these battles alone. The day moved slowly as Malcolm tried to shake the heaviness of the night before. After Jenkins left, Malcolm spent the morning with his family, playing with Zion and Maya in the backyard. The sound of their laughter brought a sense of peace, a brief respite from the storm brewing in his mind. But he couldn't fully disconnect from what had happened, what always seemed to happen. In the early afternoon, Malcolm sat on the porch, watching the sun dip lower in the sky. His thoughts wandered back to his conversation with Tanya, to Sergeant Davis showing up, and to Jenkins' unexpected apology. It all felt surreal, like the world was still tilting on an uneven axis. He kept thinking about Brady, about the way the young officer had looked at him as if he were guilty before even proving otherwise. As Malcolm sat lost in thought, his phone buzzed beside him on the porch railing. He picked it up, expecting it to be Tanya or maybe Davis with another update. But it wasn't. It was a text from an unknown number, and as soon as Malcolm opened it, his heart sank. The message was simple but charged: "You're on my list." Malcolm's hands tightened around the phone, the screen glowing menacingly in the fading light. His first thought was Brady. The way the officer had looked at him, the bitterness in his voice when Malcolm had been let go. It didn't take much to connect the dots. He stood up abruptly, his mind racing. This wasn't just another part of the job, this felt personal. Malcolm knew better than to take threats lightly, even vague ones. The reality of the message hit him hard, a reminder that the fight he faced wasn't just on the job. It was in every part of his life. Malcolm paced for a moment, feeling the old instincts from his days as a uniformed officer kicking in. He knew he should report it, file a formal complaint, log the threat, but deep down Malcolm knew how this kind of thing went. It would get buried under red tape, passed around with no real resolution. Brady wasn't the type to make a public scene. He'd push Malcolm in the shadows, using the system to his advantage. The door creaked open behind him, and Tanya stepped onto the porch, her eyes narrowing as she saw the look on Malcolm's face. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with concern. Malcolm held up the phone, showing her the text. Her eyes widened, anger flashing across her face. "Brady?" she asked, already knowing the answer. Malcolm nodded slowly. "Who else?" Tanya's face hardened, her protective instincts kicking in. "You need to report this, Malcolm. You can't just let him get away with it." "I know," Malcolm replied, though the weight of the situation pressed heavily on his shoulders. "But you know how this goes. They'll investigate, Brady will deny it, and it'll turn into a back and forth with no real consequences. Guys like him always find a way to slip through the cracks." Tanya stepped closer, her hand resting on his arm. "Maybe. But you can't let fear stop you from doing what's right. You can't let him think he can scare you into silence." Malcolm looked at her, her strength and determination grounding him in that moment. She was right, he couldn't let this slide. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about his family, about the people who would come after him. It was about sending a message that intimidation wouldn't work. "I'll report it," Malcolm said finally, his voice steady. "I'll talk to Davis. Let the system handle it." Tanya's expression softened, and she gave him a small nod of approval. "Good. You can't let this sit, Malcolm. Not when it could escalate." Malcolm leaned against the porch railing, exhaling slowly. He knew he was making the right decision, but the frustration of the situation weighed on him. Being a detective, having a badge, none of it protected him from the realities of being a black man in America. The system he was part of still had too many cracks, too many places where men like Brady could thrive. As he stood there, watching the sky darken, the sound of a car pulling up in front of the house caught his attention. His pulse quickened as he glanced over, but it wasn't Brady. It was Sergeant Davis again, his expression grim, as he stepped out of his cruiser and walked up the driveway. Malcolm met him halfway, nodding a greeting. "Sarge," he said, his voice a mixture of relief and weariness. Davis looked at him carefully, then glanced down at the phone in Malcolm's hand. "You got the message, didn't you?" Malcolm's heart skipped a beat. "You knew about it?" Davis nodded grimly. "I got a call this morning. Brady's been on thin ice for a while, and last night didn't help his case. I think he's feeling the pressure and trying to push back. This isn't the first time he's made threats." Malcolm's eyes narrowed, "And nothing's been done about it." Davis shook his head, his frustration evident. "It's been hard to pin him down. He's smart, he knows how to toe the line without crossing it outright. But this is different. Now that he's targeting you, things are going to change." Malcolm's jaw tightened. He'd heard those words before. Things were going to change, but it rarely ever happened. "What's going to be done about it?" he asked, his tone firmer now. Davis met his gaze, his expression serious. "I'm putting in for an immediate investigation. This is more than just a reprimand. If we can prove it, he's done." Malcolm nodded, the weight on his shoulders lifting slightly. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a step in the right direction. "Thanks, Sarge. I appreciate you looking out for me." Davis placed a hand on Malcolm's shoulder, giving it a firm squeeze. "I look out for my own. We'll make sure this doesn't happen again." As Davis walked back to his car, Malcolm stood in the driveway, feeling the tension slowly start to release. Tanya came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her head on his back. "You did the right thing," she whispered. "We'll get through this." Malcolm nodded, the warmth of her embrace soothing him. He knew the fight wasn't over, far from it. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he wasn't fighting it alone. As the evening shadows stretched across the yard and the last of the sunlight faded from the sky, Malcolm turned and led Tanya back into the house. Whatever came next, they would face it together.